Medvedev sharply responded to Trump, clashing with Senator Lindsey Graham while Moscow stays restrained. What are the prospects under Trump's terms? We discuss with writer Rostislav Murzagulov. Rostislav, hello. Hello, Albina. I was immediately introduced to the unofficial Moscow, which is headed by my former comrade Dmitry Medvedev. Medvedev threatens Donald Trump with war, while Dmitry Peskov claims that the Kremlin has heard Trump's words. What is the situation based on Moscow's current rhetoric? How do you assess the Kremlin's position at the moment? What Dmitry Medvedev is saying is testing the limits of what is acceptable. It is clear to everyone that Medvedev is a downed pilot, and his words are not taken seriously. Dmitry Peskov acts as a spokesman for Vladimir Putin, and if he had made a serious statement, Tomahawk cruise missiles could have already been sent to Ukraine's borders. There's no point in being offended by it. We are now watching how everything will end. Vladimir Putin has been silent all this time, hiding in bunkers, providing the Russian audience with minimal information. When he does appear, as in Saint Petersburg, for example, it is so disorganized that it gives the impression of improvisation. I know very well how it all happens. When Vladimir Putin walks past sewer manholes, water pipes, people in the background, including members of his own entourage who haven't had time to be led away, and there is no parade, it looks like a spontaneous decision. He woke up in the morning and said, "We're going to St. Petersburg to take the parade." All of this is chaotic, non-rhythmic action. One of the images, taken by an unofficial camera without further processing, shows Vladimir Putin's face with pronounced skin rashes, presumably of nervous origin. This indicates his confusion and uncertainty in his actions. If he continues military action with the same intensity, Donald Trump may give him a serious response. India has agreed to stop refining Russian oil for subsequent shipment to Europe. European countries have agreed to direct shipments of petroleum products previously exported by Vladimir Putin. This critically hits Putin's interests, as the European market was a key market for him, and India served as a transit hub turning Russian oil into products with a different origin. European countries, turning a blind eye, actually continued to buy oil from Vladimir Putin, thus financing the war. Now this process is coming to an end. A situation arises in which, if the intensity of military operations remains the same, the Russian economy is deprived of a significant part of its revenues. About half of Russia's oil flowed through India, and oil revenues accounted for about half of Putin's budget. Simple calculations show that if this source is lost, the budget deficit cannot be compensated. If Vladimir Putin continues his current policies, there is not only economic but also emotional tension. Donald Trump is a man who has gotten a taste of power and submission. Even European leaders, who usually dialogue with partners across the Atlantic in a liberal and equitable manner, now behave in front of Trump in an emphatically deferential manner, as if in front of the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Donald Trump, having tasted power, may perceive Vladimir Putin's actions as another show of disrespect. Putin has a situation in which any decision is a dead end. The inevitable end of his regime, already in protracted agony, will be an agonizing process. It is important to think about how to hasten this outcome and minimize the number of victims this regime can drag down with it. Затяжной асфиксии – это абсолютно неизбежность, и конец его режима тоже. Но, конечно, надо нам с вами всем думать о том, как бы это сделать поскорее, и как бы этот Кощей утащил за собой на тот свет как можно меньше людей. Vladimir Putin is in a stalemate despite the Kremlin's declaration that it intends to continue the so-called special military operation and pursue its goals. These goals remain unclear, as Russia is not demonstrating success on the front line and the country's economy is in recession. At the same time, the question of possible assistance from China remains open, which could influence the Russian leadership's future strategy. The economy of the Russian Federation is in a pre-recession state, which is confirmed by experts' assessments. On the front, the situation remains unfavorable. Attention should be paid to the statements of Sergei Lavrov, who is the official representative of the Russian authorities and expresses the positions of a group of high-ranking officials who form the current foreign and domestic policy.
Этот товарищ, который является спикером вот этой вот, значит, банды стариков-разбойников.
This confirms what Sergei Lavrov said the other day, that there is despondency among the Russian authorities. When asked again about the goals of the so-called special military operation, instead of the previous triumphant statements, they said, "It would be nice if NATO did not expand further." At the same time, it is known that NATO expansion was not planned before the armed conflict initiated by Vladimir Putin in Europe. It is obvious that the demands have decreased. The terms demilitarization, denazification, and so on are no longer heard in statements. What is expected now is an excuse acceptable to Vladimir Putin, not to end the war, but to reduce its intensity. He needs to achieve such a reduction so that the American electorate perceives the situation as having calmed down. Many Western interlocutors have said, things have quieted down over there. However, as personal experience confirms, in reality the situation remains as grave as ever. Vladimir Putin needs to show a decrease in the intensity of hostilities in order for the conflict to cease to be an issue for Donald Trump. Trump's electorate believes that he is not effectively fulfilling the role of a world arbitrator, which many Americans believe the U.S. president should fulfill. America is perceived as the power that controls the situation on a global scale. Donald Trump is perceived as not effectively fulfilling the role of a global leader, which causes dissatisfaction of a part of the American society that expects him to take decisive actions. At the same time, coordination with European countries is being formed. Trump arrived in Scotland where he held meetings with Ursula von der Leyen and Keir Starmer. The question is how ready European leaders are for increased support for Ukraine, including Trump's initiative for additional arms deliveries. It is also worth assessing the extent to which Europe is willing to stop importing Russian oil as a measure of economic pressure on Vladimir Putin. Albina, I remember how we in the studio criticized European leaders who expressed support for Ukraine by patting it on the shoulder, but at the same time increased their oil purchases from Vladimir Putin compared to pre-war levels. Donald Trump's main achievement was to reach an agreement with European countries. The U.S. pledged to compensate Europe for the volumes of oil products previously supplied by Putin directly or through India. The flow of petrodollars from Vladimir Putin to Europe will be interrupted. After that, his opportunities will be significantly reduced. This is exactly the specifics that we have been expecting for several years and have been discussing in this studio and on other respected TV channels around the world. A draft law has been submitted to the State Duma of the Russian Federation on year-round conscription due to the shortage of personnel to be sent to the zone of contact. This decision is aimed at speeding up the process of forming the contingents needed for combat operations. However, given that not all conscripts are ready to sign contracts, the question remains whether such a measure can compensate for the shortage of human resources. The initiative is aimed at stabilizing the frontline supply through simplified conscription. The authorities of the Russian Federation are trying to establish conscription, but are facing difficulties in recruiting young people. The problem started from the first days of mobilization. Attempts to convince conscripts under the influence of propaganda about NATO as a threat have little effect, as the new generation does not take these arguments seriously.
говорить ему все вот это вот про то, что злая НАТО сейчас, значит, тебя. Значит, но это на них не очень действует, потому что, это все-таки другое уже немножко поколение. Я
Most
даже
young
не
people have no
идеализирую
desire
никого,
to participate
но
in
желания
combat
убивать или
operations.
быть убитыми, тем более, мне
Therefore,
кажется, нет.
the idea of
Там
year-round
много.
conscription
И
looks like a
поэтому это
desperate
просто
move,
конечный
like a
производитель.
random
Вот такой,
shot at
если
a goal
хотите,
from a long
удар
distance with
отчаяния,
no
как
real
вот
chance of
по-английски
results.
говорят, когда,
It is an attempt,
сдавшись, там кто-то
behind which there is no
чувствует, что
certainty of success.
совершенно ничего не получится, но вот он хотя бы попытался.
This is an attempt at mobilization that has previously shown relative effectiveness among marginalized segments of the population aged 40-50 in the periphery of the Russian Federation and its regions, where there are no alternatives for getting out of debt or improving living conditions. Young people are skeptical of these appeals, so there is no expectation of successful recruitment among the younger generation. The Russian authorities are reducing payments to previously recruited servicemen not out of a good life, but because of an acute shortage of financial resources. There is still a need for military personnel, but funds for their maintenance are becoming increasingly scarce. Even without the withdrawal of India and Europe from the Russian oil market, the budget is experiencing a serious deficit. Today, it is about 4 trillion rubles. It is impossible to patch this hole since the National Welfare Fund has actually been spent and the remaining funds are frozen. No one is willing to provide loans to a bankrupt regime. Therefore, it is not surprising that European intelligence services and Donald Tusk have announced the possible prospect of a full-scale invasion of NATO countries by the Russian Federation. These statements concern the future period, because at the moment Vladimir Putin lacks the ability to even conduct a successful operation on Pokrovsk. His army has not been able to capture this city for about a year and a half. An offensive on Berlin or Paris is out of the question under current conditions. If Russia goes military and finally turns into a system of military communism, resources will be devoted exclusively to the production of tanks and missiles. As happened in the late Soviet Union, industry may cease to produce civilian goods and stores will become empty. Nevertheless, arms production would remain. This pattern is characteristic of authoritarian regimes like Putin's and the Soviet Union's.
Поэтому вот в этом прелесть, в кавычках, вот таких вот диктатур, как путинская и как советская.
This is the only source of support for such regimes. If the authorities of the Russian Federation stop the war and try to focus on development, it will prove impossible. The country is unable to start producing high-tech products such as iPhones because it cannot produce even the simplest goods, including nails. The reason for this is the corrupt economic model based on the distribution of oil revenues, which is characteristic of an oil-producing state. If a state stops intimidating both the external environment and its own population with the idea of being surrounded by enemies and the need for military action, it will quickly disintegrate. Such collapse is inevitable anyway because any empire sooner or later comes to an end because of internal disproportions. Instead of food, tanks are produced that cannot feed people. This leads to a social explosion and the dismantling of power, including the removal of Vladimir Putin and other representatives of the regime. It will happen, but it is important that the global community act more effectively and decisively by taking simple steps, such as ending financial support for Vladimir Putin's regime with petrodollars. We've been discussing this for 2 years, and Donald Trump and Ursula von der Leyen only recently came to this decision. It is good that, at least now. While the war continues in the Russian Federation, society experiences its impact mainly through everyday inconveniences, restrictions on foreign travel, flight delays, and logistical problems. Margarita Simonian recently mentioned that her children were forced to sleep in the hallway because of a drone strike. This is the 4th year of the war, and for most Russians, the effects are just beginning to be felt. The possibility of public protest remains an open question. Despite the growing discontent, the idea of tolerance, actively broadcast by Simonian, still finds support among a part of the population, including apolitical citizens. While for some people, the difficulties are expressed in small things like travel inconveniences, others face daily threats to life and destruction. The suffering that Russians are currently experiencing is perceived as mythical in the face of the reality of war. However, within Russia, there is a growing number of those who are convinced of the need to end it, regardless of political views or personal involvement.
Несовместимые вещи, несравнимые, однако они там считают, что они очень страдают на самом деле. И у них все больше людей в этом уверены, и все больше людей хотят, чтобы это закончилось так или иначе.
The Ukrainian leadership and the armed forces of Ukraine have chosen a path that does not involve terrorist methods. This demonstrates that Ukraine is not a terrorist state and respects international conventions, even though an unjust and illegal war is being waged against it. It also demonstrates the rationality of the Ukrainian military command, as the use of bloody terrorist attacks against another country does not induce a desire to surrender, but instead generates fierce resistance. The level of hatred for Vladimir Putin in Ukraine continues to rise, including those who have previously sympathized with Russia, numbering up to 90% of the population in the best years. The Ukrainian leadership strikes exclusively at military targets, but the consequences of these strikes cause significant domestic inconvenience to Russian citizens. Behind the facade of such glib language as denying the ability to fly to Venice, there are real changes in the daily lives of Russians that make it difficult for them to enjoy their usual comforts. During the season, it is difficult to buy a trip due to a shortage of airplanes, with 10-15% of the air fleet out of service every year. Last week, 75,000 people were unable to fly, and it was not just flights to Venice. Some were flying from Moscow to Ufa, others to Baikal. Constant internet and GPS outages in the Russian Federation create serious difficulties, including the inability to fully utilize cab services.
Постоянные, бесконечные отключения интернета в России, GPS. Невозможно воспользоваться, например, нормально сервисом такси.
Services that once provided vital support to residents of Russia's major cities are no longer accessible. Dense high-rise construction and poor infrastructure hinder movement, making delivery services the only way for many to get food and essentials amid transport disruptions and technical failures. Nothing is working, which creates serious domestic political pressure in the Russian Federation to end the conflict. Representatives of the government and big business are losing significant financial resources as a result of current events. The revolt in the Russian Federation may rather start within the elites and then develop into an interethnic revolt, after which the broad masses of people may be involved. This is due to the current structure of society. Yevgeny Prigozhin has already initiated such an elitist protest. Yevgeny Prigozhin's march on Moscow was a classic manifestation of elitist rebellion, but he lacked the resolve to overthrow Vladimir Putin. Despite his criminal past and reputation as a thug, this might have been perceived as less of a threat. It is possible that there is another such figurehead in the elite's entourage who is under criminal investigation or threatened with loss of customary privileges. Losses have affected a significant part of the Russian oligarchs. For them, the loss of billions of dollars in assets means the loss of influence and status with which they were associated as the leaders of destinies. Oleg Deripaska, for example, acquired Straybag, one of the largest construction companies in Europe.
Для человека, который был таким вершителем судеб, который был везде в фоше, который был везде уважаем, и вон Дерипаска захотел, купил крупнейшую компанию, значит, Европы строительную, Штрабак, да.
Russian oligarchs, accustomed to the status of influential figures, are rapidly losing ground, turning into dependent journeymen. Several of them have already been arrested and sentenced to long prison terms. This leads to the pooling and sharing of information among the elite. Each of them has knowledge of Vladimir Putin's vulnerable points, because like any dictator, he is completely dependent on his inner circle.
И каждый из них знает очень много многое о Путине. Каждый из них знает очень много его ахиллесовых пят, потому что Путин, как любой диктатор, абсолютно уязвим, потому что любой диктатор зависим от своей свиты.
An aging dictator in Moscow risks losing control if his entourage misleads him or withdraws loyalty. At a recent ceremony, Putin appeared disoriented, greeting an imaginary figure and unsure where to go, a moment compared to Joe Biden. This scene symbolically reflects the regime's decline, raising the question of who among his circle might dare to remove him. Valentina Matvienko spoke at a conference in Geneva. Yuri Borisov, head of Roscosmos, held talks in Europe. This raises questions given their support for Vladimir Putin's regime. Perhaps behind-the-scenes arrangements related to the Russian-Ukrainian war are taking place, and information is being passed to Vladimir Putin through such contacts. Otherwise, it is difficult to explain why these representatives are accepted in the countries of the democratic world.
Возможно, ведутся какие-то кулуарные договоренности касательно российско-украинской войны, и таким образом, возможно, передается информация Путину. Я не знаю, просто иначе я не вижу оправдания тому, почему вот эти вот персонажи принимаются в демократическом мире.
Given the current situation, the emotions of Ukrainians, including contempt for Ukrainian-born Valentina Matvienko and other representatives of the regime, are understandable. However, the logic behind allowing such figures on international platforms is the Western countries' desire to establish channels for obtaining information and gradually weakening Vladimir Putin's regime from within, even if such an approach is emotionally objectionable.
Сейчас то время, когда все они должны навести такие мостики для получения информации, для потихонечку расшатывания путинского режима изнутри. Потому что даже вот представьте себе ситуацию, которая нам с вами, как людям, эмоционально, конечно, не может нравиться.
This hypothetical situation might suggest that every supporter of Vladimir Putin is invited to Western countries, where detailed negotiations are held, explaining the possible consequences of his continued support for the regime. At the same time, potential forgiveness or leniency is discussed, for example, for the children of these individuals if they provide information about Putin's secret assets or vulnerabilities, similar to the metaphor of Koshchai's egg with a hidden needle.
Значит, спрятано вот то, а где у него вот это, а где у Кощея яйцо, а в котором из них, значит, иголка спрятана.
Such actions have historically been taken in international practice and have elicited similar public reactions. If anyone from the Vladimir Putin regime's entourage cooperates and provides useful information supporting the weakening of the system, the author is ready to express his gratitude publicly, including a proposal to erect a monument, albeit not bronze, but polypropylene, as a token of appreciation. It is now difficult to assess unequivocally whether there may have been a leak, although such contacts cannot be ruled out. The Kremlin likely closely monitors the travels of Russian officials abroad, including their meetings and the content of the talks. The Kremlin should not be overestimated. Ukrainians should not think that the Russian leadership has a brilliant strategy. In practice, it demonstrates incompetence. The latest Ukrainian-Belarusian operation against Aeroflot clearly shows this. One of the relatives of a high-ranking Russian FSB representative was in charge of security at the company. The Russian authorities try to create an image of formidable and all-knowing figures, but in reality they often turn out to be inept. Ukrainian and Belarusian opposition activists spent a year inside the system, downloading data and inflicting damage that will take at least a year to repair Aeroflot. The praised security measures failed, revealing a colossus on clay feet. Okay, so the blow to Aeroflot, what does that mean? Aside from canceled flights and disgruntled Russians, the airlines will be rebuilding for some time to come. What does this mean for us? Do you have any information where we can learn more about the damage this has done to Russia? Peskov stated, "We are informed. We will look into it." Lately, he has only been saying that he is informed, but not drawing conclusions.
Возможно, у вас есть какая-то информация, где можно как бы глубже узнать о том, какой вред это нанесло России, потому что Песков вышел с заявлением, он сказал, мы поинформированы, будем разбираться. Но Песков, в принципе, в последнее время, на самом деле, выходит с заявлениями, то есть он никаких не дает выводов, он просто говорит, мы поинформированы, мы услышали, мы знаем.
The importance of transportation within the system cannot be underestimated, as many processes depend on flights between regions to function. Hacker groups have seriously disrupted this mechanism, resulting in a reduction in the number of flights, schedule changes, and a halt in the airline's development. Due to the inability to fulfill loan obligations, the air fleet is being reduced and the capacity for domestic passenger transportation is decreasing.
Развития компании нет, компания не может платить по кредитам, соответственно, уменьшается ее авиапарк, уменьшаются ее возможности для перевозки внутри людей.
The country is approaching the stage of stagnation we predicted. This is part of the strategy to destroy Russian logistics, including Ukrainian drone strikes on railroad stations. This is an extremely important aspect, because with one powerful national carrier such as Aeroflot, transport links stabilize the functioning of the economy. When transportation starts to fail, the whole system comes to a halt. The damage to Russia's logistics infrastructure has already been done.
Независимо от каких-то колебаний на рынке, он выполняет свою работу, страна по этим шестеренкам смазанным едет дальше. А если вдруг транспортное сообщение начинает сбиваться, то страна по этим шестеренкам не едет.
Ну а вот, в принципе, как вы видите тот вред российской логистике, который уже нанесли?
Today, the no-fly option in the Russian Federation is becoming the default choice for many, including those who share sensitive information about what is happening. This poses a significant problem, as the restriction of movement within the country and the reduction of interpersonal interactions hinder the normal functioning of society. Such processes trigger internal degradation of the system and may eventually lead to its destruction.
Это большая проблема, то есть когда человек не перемещается по стране, когда люди не взаимодействуют друг с другом, вот тут тогда и начинаются вот те процессы негативные, которых мы все так ждем, которые в конце концов разрушают режимы.
Rostislav, thank you for the conversation and for giving us the opportunity to understand more deeply what is happening in the Russian Federation. News is only the surface, but analytics allows us to realize the real processes. You have inside knowledge of the situation, have contacts with Russian citizens, and therefore provide an accurate picture of the impact of events on domestic politics, the economy, and the country's ability to continue the armed conflict. Thank you. Rostislav Murzagulov, writer, publicist, and public figure, was a guest of the stream.
Эту кровавую войну. Спасибо большое. Ростислав Мурзагулов, писатель, публицист и общественный деятель, был гостем этого стрима.
Always a pleasure.